Today I have another Framer Motion video for you. And this time we're not gonna build a full website, but rather we're gonna focus on a very small component that has a lot of super nice details. And that component actually is this button component. And the button component might look basic at first glance, but if you click on it, there's actually some really nice things happening. What you see is that all of the letters move up one by one and that there's also some nice sparkling happening. And all of these things are done with Framer Motion and actually with their new animation sequences. And that is what we'll be exploring today. Because I think these sequences are a super nice addition to Framer Motion. The design is actually inspired by a tweet I found online by Jamie Salmon, or Saman. And I just like this animation a lot and I thought, okay, let's see how we can replicate this in Framer Motion. Because as far as I could see, he did not implement this in his own website yet. So that's what we're gonna do today. And what better way to start off with an empty page. And by the way, notice that I actually am zoomed in 200%, so everything is twice as big as it should be, but that's simply because it's a small component and that way you can see it a bit better. So let's first start with adding a really basic button with the text motion on there. Then we're gonna style it a little bit with tailwind. First is rounded full, and we're gonna give this a 2-pixel border of border blue 600. And we're also gonna give this some padding on the X and Y axis so the button looks a little bit better. Also, the text should be blue 600 as well. And if we hover this, we want to make this background blue 100. And let's also then add a transition background, so the background just nicely transitions. And of course, it should be transition colors and not transition backgrounds, because transition colors is a valid CSS class and background is not. And that way, we already have a nice button that we can hover. If we look at the video of this animation though, we can see that they actually move every letter one by one. So if we scroll through this video, we see that all of the letters actually move up individually. So that means that we need to have some sort of way to target every letter. So instead of just putting the word in here, I'm actually gonna render different spans around every letter. So that way we can later target them. However, it is also super important that screen readers can still use this button as well. So for them, I'm actually gonna wrap this inside a span and add a class name of SR only. So this way the text will be hidden to people who are not visually impaired, but screen readers will read this text. And then next to that, I'm gonna add another span with area hidden, which is then something that's not read to a screen reader. And in there, I'm actually gonna create an array that has all of the different letters of the word motion. And those letters, we are simply gonna render as a span. So span, and then we're gonna render the letter in there, and we're gonna close the span. Of course, we also need to have a key letter, and then we're also gonna add the index on there, because, for example, we have multiple O's, so otherwise we would have elements with the same key. And if we do that and go back to our app, we still see we have the exact same button. However, if I inspect this button, what you see now is that all of the different letters are wrapped inside their own span. And this way we can actually animate them one by one. And that is, in case of this animation, super valuable. But note again that this is not visible for screen readers, but this is. And the other way around, this text is not visible to us, and this is visible to us. Simply because we want to have something for screen readers that's also readable to them, instead of something they can't really make sense of. And in order to animate this with Framer Motion, this time we'll be using the new sequences animations. And these sequences animations really make it pretty straightforward to define these animations, and especially define dependencies within them. And we can use these sequences by using a pretty new hook from Framer Motion, which is called useAnimate. And that will give us both a scope as well as an animate function. This scope actually is a ref. So that means that Framer Motion expects us to set this ref on an element that is a parent of the things we want to animate. So that means that in this case, we want to set this on this wrapper div. We can do that by adding ref equals to scope. And from that point on, we can start using this animate function. First, let's add a const on button click, which is then a function. And that on button click, we're gonna connect to the on click event of the button. And inside that on button click, we can actually run our animate function. And you could, just like in normal Framer motion, also manipulate one element in here, but we can also pass in an array. And that gives us the option to manipulate multiple things in a second. And that is what creates these sequences. Because next to animating these letters, in a second we also want to scale in the button and also create all of these sparkles as well. So inside this array, we can actually add another array. And this array takes in 3 arguments. The first one will be a selector, simply a CSS DOM selector. That should be an element that is a child of this ref element. So in order to target all of the different letters, I think it's good if we would add another class name. A class name, for example, call letter maybe? Makes sense. Because now we have something that we can target. And that class we can simply add in here by adding letter. And then as a second argument, it takes in a Framer motion animation configuration. What a word. However, that animation could, for example, be a movement on the y-axis of -32 pixels. And then as a third argument, it takes in a configuration for the animation, where you, for example, can set the duration of 0.2 seconds. And if we then click this button, we see that it sets the animation styles. However, the letters don't animate yet. And that is because in this case, I decided to use a span. And a span is by default inline, which is something that you cannot properly translate. So if we make this inline block, you see that the movement happens. So if we now refresh and click again, we see that the letters move up. They do it all at the same time though. But it's pretty easy in Framer motion to also make this go one by one. For that, we have a delay property where we can add a function as its value. It could also be a number, like you already see that Copilot suggests, but it would delay everything at exactly the same time. The function we can add is called stagger. And that stagger function is then imported from Framer motion. And in there, we can set a value, for example, 0.05, which means that every item will be delayed with 0.05 seconds. So a quarter of the duration of the previous letter animation. And if we then refresh again and click, we see that they animate up one by one. But again, if we look at this original video, we see that one letter moves up, but there is also a new letter appearing. And it almost looks like it is kind of a portal. The letter that goes up comes back from the bottom side. And perhaps you can make something like this with CSS, but I was thinking we can also just make sure that there's 2 letters for every letter and then put them right underneath each other and move the letters up. So that way you have exactly the same effect. However, I don't want to copy this loop again and have all of the letters duplicate in my render as well, because I think it's a little bit annoying to work with. So there's a super neat trick in CSS where you can render a pseudo element with specific content. And that content can come, for example, from a data attribute. So we can, for example, add data-letter is letter. And then we can use this letter to render inside a pseudo element. In this case, an after element. And that after element will then get positioned absolute right underneath the other letter. So let's go back to our code. And then, because we're using position absolute, I'm gonna add relative already to this. And I'm also gonna add a fixed height of 8. And this height of 8 is actually exactly the same as the 32 pixels. And that is not a coincidence, because of course we need to move up the height of one letter to make this animation work. So next to this, we're then gonna add a after. And that after also has a height of 8. The after is also position absolute. And then the after is also left 0 and after top full. So that way it is positioned right underneath the previous letter. And then there is one thing missing, and that is actually the contents of this letter. And that we can add by adding after dash content, and then another dash with square brackets. And in there we can use author like attribute and set data dash letter. And it should actually be after colon, like all the afters. And then you already see what happened. It looks like the word is there twice. But if we look at the DOM and inspect this, we see that there's only one N rendered. But there's also this after element, which is actually the exact same letter. The next thing we still need to do though is also make sure that we only see one letter at a time. So this wrapper comes in handy then. Because first, let's also make sure that we add the exact same height on here. Because that way, if we add an overflow hidden and also make this display block because it's a span again, we only see one letter. The other one is simply hidden. Next, I also want to make this display flags instead of display block actually. And then add item center and justify center on here. And if we then add a leading of 8 as well, so the line height of the text is the same height. And maybe also make this text 2XL so things are a little bit bigger. Then everything is in the center and we only see one letter. But if we click, we see that the letters move up, but because of the overflow, they're not visible anymore. So if we refresh again, we already see that we kind of have achieved a similar effect, which is super neat. Because looking at the amount of code we need for this, and especially for the animation, I am really stoked with these animate sequences, because next up is also making the button bounce or scale in and out also within the sequence of this animation. And that's actually not a lot of work to achieve. First, let's move some stuff to a new line because we need to add another array in here. And in that array, I want to select our button. And then I want to say scale of 0.8 and a duration of 0.1. And if I would leave it at this, it would already work. But there is one thing we need to change in a second. But first, let's click this. And then you see our button scales down. But what you notice is you click, it animates, and then it moves down. And the reason for that is because every sequence is run after each other instead of at the same time. However, you can add another property in here, add, and that add can have a bracket like this, and that actually means run at the exact same time of the previous animation. So that means that suddenly these two run at exactly the same time. You can also, for example, add a -1 or -0.5. That means that it should run half a second before the other one has ended. In our case, we actually want to run them at exactly the same time. And then, after this animation is completed, we actually want to animate the button back to 1. Which also means that we need to remove this, because otherwise they would also run at exactly the same time and you wouldn't see any animation. But if we remove this, then refresh and click the button, you see that at exactly the same time the letter animates and also the button bounces. However, if we keep on clicking, the letters won't animate anymore. And that is because the letters already are at -32 pixels. So that means that we also need to reset them. And resetting is something we can do by again targeting these letters and setting a value of 0. However, if we would add a duration, you would see them move back. And that's something that we don't want to see. We actually don't want the user to notice that we are doing this kind of hack and moving everything back in place. So I'll remove the delay and also make the duration super short. But if we click now, we see that stuff kind of seems to jump around. The first letter is okay and the last ones maybe as well, but there is something funky happening. And the reason for that is because this animation is actually triggered at the start of the previous one. So that means that this one that is dependent on its previous one, because there's no add property, will run when this one is completed. However, the stagger of this one is then still going on. So that means that we'll end up here before this stagger is actually finished. So therefore, we can add an add property that has a numeric value of, for example, 0.5. And that way, after half a second, this will trigger and reset. So that means that if we now click, everything looks super smooth. Simply because we're only resetting this half a second after it started. So that way everything only resets at the right moment. And by doing that, we already have a button that bounces and animates the text at the same time. And because of the sequences, we also have a pretty neat overview of what is running when and what it's doing. So in my opinion, these sequences are a super nice way to configure your animations, simply because they give you a really good overview. And now you might be thinking, okay, and now I really want to see those sparkles. Well, let's do that next. Let's add in these sparkles. Because thanks to these sequences, it's not a lot of effort actually to do this. First, let me copy in an SVG that is a star. So that thing looks like this, and you already see it. It's just a basic star. But that's a star that we're actually gonna animate and create sparkles out of. And actually, we don't need one, but we need, I don't know, 20 maybe. So I'm actually thinking about simply rendering 20 SVGs in this page, because it's like really a motion effect and it's not constantly running on the page and everything like that. So it's pretty safe to do this simply with DOM elements instead of something like Canvas. Of course, Canvas can do this as well, but that's a whole different course and a whole different video. Right now, we're doing this with Framer Motion. So let's not render only one, but let's render 20. And we can do that by, for example, creating array.from with a length of 20 and then map over this array. That gives us a list of 20 things. And you already see we have 20 icons now. So what this does is it creates a new array that has 20 empty slots. And like normally in a map, the first value will be the value of each item in the array. And in this case, that's undefined because we're not putting anything in there, we're just making a new empty array. However, we need to have some sort of key. So for this, we can use the index, so we can still set a key on here. And that key, we can simply give the value of the index. And then I don't want to have all of these SVGs taking up space because we want to animate them everywhere. So first I'm gonna add a new wrapper span in here. And that span we're gonna make position absolute. That also means that our button should become relative because we want to make this position absolute to the button. And then we can set this inset of 0 and also make this display block because it's a span. And then, for example, add a background wrap 300 to see what we're doing. And then you see that we're actually creating a span that is exactly the dimensions of the button. And because we have that now, we can again make our SVGs also position absolute and make them halfway from the left and halfway from the top. So that way they're pretty much in the center. We could put them fully in the center by also doing some transforms, but because in a second we're also doing transforms to move them everywhere, I think this is an okay position for the stars to start from. Also, I'm gonna give this wrapper pointer events none, so you cannot interact with the stars or the wrapper at all, because that would interfere with clicking of the button. And I'm also gonna give this a z-index of a -10, so it's actually behind the button instead of on top of it. And then I'm gonna remove the background. On top of that, I'm also gonna add area hidden to this span, because this is also something that's not of interest to screen readers. And then we're finally at the point where we are gonna animate these stars. So for that, we need to go back to our animate function again. I do, however, want to add some randomness to the stars because they should shoot out in every direction and also a little bit more random. However, that would mean that we need to target every item one by one in this animate sequence so we can add some randomness in there. One other solution would be that we simply generate sequences when we click on this button. So we could, for example, again, create new sparkles, which is array.from with a length of 20. So that way we have, again, 20 random empty arrays in this case. And then we could create a variable called, for example, sparkles animation. And in there, we actually map our sparkles, where we again get the index as the second argument. And then in here, we can return an array with all of the different animations we want to do for the sparkle. We do, however, need a class to target them. So for that, we first need to go back to our SVG and add a class name that we can target. So that class name could, for example, be sparkle-index. So that way we have a class name and we can inspect them as well. Sparkle 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And these classes we can then target to animate. So in here, our selector will also become sparkle index. And then we can set an X with a random number. And we could, for example, use mod.random for that. But I actually wrote a small function to my right, which I'm going to copy in now, that creates a random number for us. It also uses mod.random and mod.floor to do stuff for us, but it's just a bit more readable. So then we can use that function to create, for example, a random number between 100 and minus 100. And we can also do the exact same for y. And lastly, also for the scale, I actually want to have a random number between 1 and 2.5. Or maybe even 1.5, because otherwise it won't scale at all. And lastly, I'm also gonna add an opacity of 1, which is just fixed. But I'm gonna do that because I'm actually gonna add an opacity of 0 now, because we don't want to see them in the first place. And now the only thing missing still is adding a third object where we can add a duration of, for example, 0.4 seconds. And lastly, all of these animations should also run at exactly the same time, so at the previous time. And this then gives us an array of all of the different sparkles that are going to transition. So we can then copy in this animation and just add this in right when the button starts to scale back. We need to spread that array, of course. And I also need to copy in some type definitions because somehow Framer Motion doesn't seem to export their animation types, but that's a whole different topic. That's just something for TypeScript that I need to do right now. But then these sparkles are simply added into the animation sequence. And because of this value, they're actually running at exactly the same time. And that means if we now refresh and click this button, we already see that these sparkles appear. And I can refresh and you see that now they're random in a totally different position, which is simply awesome. This looks already super nice. The only thing missing now is that these stars also disappear again. And maybe you already guessed it, we can create a sparkles fade out. That's again an animation. Okay, let's see what Copilot thinks. Opacity 0, yes, yes. Then a duration of 0.4, all at the same time, yes. Seems okay what Copilot is thinking. I do, however, also want to scale them to 0, because that's also part of the other video I saw, that everything seems to shrink in as well. And I think I want to make the disappearing a little bit quicker. But then we can just copy this new fade and add this right after the last animation. And if we now refresh again, we see that the stars fade in and out. But we also see one other interesting thing happening, and that is that they also kind of seem to rotate. And the reason for that is because if we look at our SVGs, they still have an inline style. So this style is not cleared at the end of the animation. So that means that we actually need one more animation, which is sparkles reset. That again selects a sparkle. And then it's set ES X to 0 and Y to 0. With a duration, that's just super quick because we don't want to see it, so Copilot is also right in this. And then we're gonna close the brackets. And this reset is simply something I'm actually gonna run at exactly the beginning of our animation. So that way we always reset everything. And if we now run this animation again, nothing seems to happen anymore. And that is because we're telling Framer Motion to run this sequence at 0.5. But that means that if anything is still in progress, it will skip to this animation. And at that moment, our sparkles are actually still running. So what we can do now, because our sparkles animation takes long enough for our letters to complete, is that we can simply remove this at. And if we do that and refresh, we see that we have sparkles animations that fade out, but also if we click again, we see that they appear again and that they're also fully random this time. And to me, this looks super nice. I'm really stoked that I found this video on Twitter because this is something that's so nice to build as well. All of these animations, they're just super nice, and this really shows the power of Framer Motion as well, and also the power of these new sequences. And even if you want to add in some randomness, you can simply use these generator functions to create your random sequences. And with that, we're at the end of today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video and that you also think these animations are super cool and useful. So I hope you learned a few more Framer Motion tips and tricks. And if you want to learn even more Framer Motion tips, definitely join my Discord as well, so I can really help you and guide you in the right direction. Next to that, like always, the code is also linked down in the description below as well, where you can also find a live playground to experiment with this yourself. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, leave a like and leave a comment below as well. Don't forget to subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.